To my listeners. Hello, everybody. This is Richie Valentine. When I was 18 years old, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing with the rest of my life. I had just barely scraped by in high school, and college was not in any type of foreseeable future. So, I decided to throw myself into the lives of other people for a little while. Well, as it just so happened, my dad told me about this book. I looked it up and I started to read, and I was absolutely enthralled from beginning to end. I can only hope that this narration does both the author and these pages any type of justice whatsoever. I would like to thank my dad for making this book known to me to begin with. But more importantly, I would like to thank Meredith Ann Pierce. If ever you hear this, your books have served not only as a source of entertainment for me, but a source of inspiration as well. Thank you, wherever you are. Now I invite you all to sit back, relax, and enjoy the first chapter of The Darkangel by Meredith Ann Pierce. Read for you by Richie Valentine. Chapter 1. The Steeps of Terrain. Ariel rested the broad basket against her hip and adjusted her kirtle. The steep climb she and her companion had been taking the last 600 paces or so had caused the loose, flowing garment to twist around at the neck and fall askew. I have to rest," she said faintly, and not waiting for her companion's reply, sank down on the hard, gray, brittle rock of the mountainside and set the empty basket down beside her. It was cold up on the steeps, the air too thin to hold any heat. But Solstar was warm, a bare 6 hours from setting. Its white light streamed back at her from the eastern horizon, warm on her bare arms and neck and face, warming the broken rock shelf on which she sat. Ariel gazed out over the wide plain of Avrek, fair as a pearl, bright as foxfire beneath the black, starry heavens. Asinus hung, a swirl of blue and white, almost directly ahead of her. Below, she could see her village over to the right, tiny, far away, at the foot of the mountain and the edge of the plain. "Come on," said Yodwin, digging her toe into Ariel's backside. "We've still a way to go yet." Ariel sighed and got up, followed her companion. Yodwin was tall and slender, as befitted a person of lineage. After all, she was the daughter of the village syndic, and her mother was half-sister to the satrap. She had a carriage about her, Ariel observed wistfully, all self-sure and comely arrogance that came of living all her life in the largest house in the village, with 16 different kirtles. Think of it! 16! Ariel had just 2, and house servants. Ariel was one of these. She gazed longingly at her well-born mistress's hair, black as the heavens, with a blue sheen by earthlight. Yodwin's skin, pale and blue as breast milk, had a subtle radiance that gleamed even in shadow. But Ariel, slighter than her companion by a head, was boy-shaped still, her skin deeper shaded, a wan rose tan that even bleaching with lightning weed could not expunge. And her hair, thinner and finer than Yodwin's, was silvery yellow, pretty enough by daylight or lamplight, but it took on a hideous greenish cast, like unripe figs by earthshine. Ariel sighed and scrambled up the slope after Yodwin, admiring the other's long-limbed stride, envying, but hopelessly, the unconscious ease with which the syndic's daughter held her basket slung over her back like a cloak. Ariel knew that when she began blooming into maidenhood, as Yodwin was blooming now, even then she could never hope to match her mistress's proud grace. After another 100 paces, Ariel said, "We're getting awfully high." Without turning around, her companion answered, "The summit's not much farther." "I can't see the village any more," said Ariel. It was true. The turn they had just taken had led them around the mountain face a few degrees. Yodwin laughed. What are you afraid of? She said, her sapphire eyes now mocking merry. Darkangels? She stopped a moment to let Ariel come up beside her. You really do believe that old cradle tale Bumba was telling us, said Yodwin. Don't you? Ariel thought back on the strange, half-silly, half-deliciously exciting stories the bumbling old wife sometimes spun for her young charges at the distaff. She had told them one only a few hours before Ariel and Yodwin had set out from the village to gather wedding flowers on the steeps, by way of a caution, Ariel supposed, though this one had come out more muddled and therefore ludicrous than sobering. Yodwin dropped her basket to the ground. Ariel watched as she hunched up her shoulders and screwed up her face in imitation of the old nurse's features. "The wraith," she whispered as if toothless, "the wraith that roam the mountains, snatching bodies, causing landslides. Believe me," she wagged one claw finger at Ariel. "Believe me, girl, I've seen them. Don't you go high up on those steeps or you'll regret it if you live to regret it." Ariel bit her lip to suppress a smile. Yodwin always reduced her to helpless mirth. "And the vampires," Yodwin wailed, "the Ichidai, with dozens of black wings and the faces of demons. One'll turn you to stone, and then where'll you run, girl?" The syndic's daughter began to worry her hands and mutter, "One'll swoop you away to his castle and make you his bride. And you know what the Ichidai does with their brides, don't you, girl?" Her voice had thinned from a low whisper to a faint hysterical shriek. Ariel wrapped her arms about her ribs and fought to hold back laughter. "They drinks up their souls," Yodwin shrilled, then sank to her knees, gasping. "Oh, my heart, my poor heart," exactly as Ariel had seen her half-senile old nurse doing numberless times. Ariel gave up, laughed until she felt breathless and giddy, though the air on the high steeps was too thin for laughing properly or long. She felt a little sick with the altitude and had to sit down again, rest her forehead on her knees. Sobering now, she kept her face hidden. She did not want Yodwin moving on before she could regain her breath. Unsmiling now, Ariel thought about Bumba's stories and shook her head. No, it was not the tales of Bumba that had worried her, fat, good-natured Bumba, but Dirna's. Gaunt, furtive Dirna, who used to sit at the loom in the workroom, a little distance from the others, staring off at nothing, her spare, withered fingers weaving by touch. Her tales were of a different sort from Bumba's. Dirna whispered of dracs and witches, gargoyles and specters, horrifying tales of death by drowning. Yodwin always laughed at them as she did at Bumba's simple-minded fables, but they made Ariel shudder. Dirna never got muddled in her tellings. She spoke as if she knew. Ariel raised her head from her knees. Yodwin had risen and shaken off her guise. Pulling a few black strands of hair from her large, clear blue eyes, she kicked her basket deftly downhill toward Ariel, then nodded for her bondservant to follow as she strode gracefully up the path. Ariel sighed shortly, collecting her mistress's basket along with her own, wished she had a servant to caddy for her whenever she grew tired of carrying. "Cheer up, Worry Wrinkle," Yodwin cried over one shoulder. "What vampire would want you?" Ariel shook the frown from her face. "No, it's just that," she began, starting after her companion and tripping. Balancing on the steep slope while clutching a basket in each hand was proving difficult. She scrambled to her feet, snatched up Yodwin's basket before it could roll away down slope like tumblebrush, and hurried up along her mistress again. "It's just that the sun will be down in a few hours, and—" "6!" cried Yodwin, laughing. "We've plenty of time before nightshade." "Yes, but what if—" "Oh!" Ariel almost lost her footing again on the smooth, crumbling rock, and Yodwin pulled her to her feet without so much as a glance or a pause in stride. Ariel held tight to the baskets. "But what if one of us gets hurt?" she continued, "or loses the way?" "Don't you mean what if you get hurt?" asked Yodwin without rancor. "After all, you seem to be the only one stumbling." She laughed and did not offer to help carry. But by the Pendarlon, if I'd known you'd been so clumsy, I might have allowed for more time." Ariel blushed and looked away. It was true. She was clumsy, and beside her mistress's deft grace always felt doubly so. Her companion tilted one shoulder in a shrug and glanced at Ariel. "Don't fear, little lameling. If you should twist an ankle or knock yourself silly falling off a ledge, I'll carry you and the baskets back in less time than it's taken us getting this far." Ariel felt her color deepen, bit her lip against retort. She wasn't lame, just awkward and unsure. Yodwin knew that. Ariel's knuckles on the basket whitened. She glanced at Yodwin. The syndic's daughter smiled at her carelessly. Ariel's eyes stung. These were the only times she ever resented Yodwin, who used that hated name, Lameling, she realized, only to bait her. This time, though, she seemingly meant no teasing by it. Perhaps she even intended it affectionately. Ariel relaxed her hands and let her color fade. "You needn't worry about the other, either," her companion was saying. Her tone was one of friendly tolerance. "I won't lose the way, and if you keep by me, you won't either." Ariel sighed and shoved her thoughts away, fell into step behind Yodwin again. The sun felt warm on Ariel's back, and the shadows, whenever the path ducked behind boulder or ledge, were cold as well water. She dropped one basket from her hip as the trail grew narrower, let the light, bulky mesh of twined marsh grass bump along against her leg. They climbed. She fell to watching the landscape, the lie of the rocks. She listened to the bellthorn, silvery thin briars that tinkled like glass in the rare mountain wind. She watched the small rose-colored lizards sunning themselves in the last hours of Solstar before crawling into their crags again to sleep for another long nightshade. She looked at the petrified bones in the rocks, bones of fishes, eels, and water plants left over from the time when the steeps had been nothing but flat mud bottom and all the world a sea. Here are some," said Yodwin, halting so abruptly that Ariel almost ran into her. Ariel eyed the low-spread blossoming shrub at their feet. Yodwin gazed further and gestured ahead. "And there are more up the slope." They were near the pinnacle of the mountain. Ariel could scarcely feel herself breathe. The sky was blacker here, the sun whiter, the earth bluer, the stars brighter. When Ariel looked down, she could see the light luminous haze of atmosphere lying on the foothills on the plain. "You pick these," Yodwin was telling her, taking her own basket back, "and I'll get the ones farther up." It was difficult for Ariel to hear her. The air was so thin. She obviously was shouting, but Ariel, only a pace away, had trouble making out the more faintly spoken words. She nodded her reply. "You brought a flask, didn't you?" demanded Yodwin, taking hold of the empty one she herself wore on a thong hung from her neck. It was a simple water skin for desert travel, a couple of handspans long, made of white kid with an ivory stopper and beads of tinted bone. Ariel nodded and tapped her own smaller, undecorated flask hanging from her neck. "Good, then," cried Yodwin softly, as from a great distance. "Stay here in sight, don't wander, and don't spill any." Ariel nodded. Yodwin slung her basket over one shoulder and went up the last steepest 20 paces to the top. Ariel watched her easy, sure-footed ascent, her mistress's free hand resting lightly on rock or boulder from time to time to help her balance. Ariel wished that she could have been born so long-limbed, so self-sure, so beautiful. She set her basket down and knelt beside the horn scrub, began gathering the flowers. These horn flowers grew on a tiny gray-silver bush which lived only on the highest steeps where the air was rare and perilously thin, not the slightest breeze ever stirring to disturb them. Each branch of the bush was covered with tiny trumpet-shaped flowers, yellowish-white, translucent as frost. Each trump was filled with a tiny drop of pale golden liquor, sweeter than ginger and richer than rum. Ariel pulled one blossom ever so gently from its twig. The trick was to gather them one by one, painstakingly, so that not a drop was spilled in either the picking or the pouring from flower to wineskin. The task was made doubly difficult by the flocks of tiny humming swifts, no bigger than fireflies, that swarmed about the flowers and lip of the wineskin, and could, between 3 or 4 of them, drink a horn dry before Ariel could get the flower from bush to bottle. She shooed at them blossom with one hand while keeping the other holding the flower perfectly steady. Ariel dropped the first emptied trump into the mesh basket beside her and reached slowly for another bloom, and then another, and then another. The motions became mechanical. Her back began to ache and her legs felt stiff, but Ariel ignored the pains, waved away the bothersome bee-birds, and continued gathering. A marriage was to take place in the village at sundown, dusk being the customary and proper time for weddings in Avric. Yodwin, as eldest cousin to the bride, was pledged to bring the bridal cup of hornbloom nectar and the garlands of the wedding's trumps, but these could be harvested only a few hours before the marriage, the precious liquor and delicate blossoms so quickly spoiled. It seemed to Ariel as she poured the contents of another pale trumpet-shaped flower into the goat-hide bottle that the humming of the tiny swifts had grown rather louder and shrill. She tossed the empty flower into the basket and ignored the sound to concentrate on carefully plucking another blossom. She imagined the preparations in the village, the decking of the streets with banners of white gauze, the bathing of the bride. It occurred to Ariel then that the sound she was hearing was not the angry whine of humming swifts, but something else. A voice. "Yodwin is calling me," she thought as she pulled another flower away from the stalk. The pitch of the voice changed abruptly, intensified. Ariel brought the hornbloom to the rim of the bottle. No, not calling anymore, she realized suddenly. Screaming. Ariel dropped the flower, felt its droplet spill, hot as a tear. No, hotter, hot as tallow. It burned her hand. She looked up the slope to where Yodwin was. The basket of wedding trumps lay overturned at Yodwin's feet. Her young mistress was standing mute now, looking up at the sky. Then Ariel saw wings, very near, great wings descending, a creature with more wings than she could count, all black, all beating fiercely. She felt a faint breeze against her cheek. For all the fury of those terrible wings, the air was too thin to carry more than a feeble gust. They were jet, those wings, as deep as the sky, as black as Yodwin's hair. No, blacker, for they were dull, unoiled. They gave off no sheen in the light, no gleam to the eye. They drank up the light and diminished it. They were wings of pure shadow. It seemed to Ariel as she watched that storm of darkness descend that she discerned the figure of a man at its heart, a man dressed in some pale garment, a man of fair complexion, but the wings beat with such rapidity against the near empty air that she could not make out his face. The figure reached the mountain top and alighted, but barely. His sandaled feet hardly touched the stone. Before him, Yodwin cried out in terror. Though Ariel knelt not 20 paces from her, the sound was distant as though it had traveled miles. He held out his arms to Yodwin abruptly, then, as in command. Yodwin backed away. The Darkangel stepped toward her. Ariel could see only the vague white shimmer of his garment amid the fury of still-beating wings. Yodwin whirled and began to run down the slope toward Ariel. She had not taken 20 steps before the vampire had swooped and caught her. Ariel heard Yodwin's piercing cry. The Icarus's speed and Yodwin's weight bore them forward and down. The powerful wings thrashed the air. Ariel bolted to her feet, too fast. Her legs, still from long sitting, would not bear her. The vampire swooped overhead, so close Ariel could have reached to touch him. The world had reeled, and falling, she threw up her arms then, not to touch, but to ward off the cold, fleeting shade of those horrible wings. Her knees buckled. She felt her feet skid from under her. The Darkangel was gaining altitude above her. She saw Yodwin still struggling in his arms, but could no longer hear her screams. Ariel felt her elbow strike the earth, and then her shoulder, as a dozen sharp, hard, rolling pebbles dug into her flesh. The ground was in motion beneath her, slipping, sliding. The Icarus was already far away, a dark blot against the stars. She glimpsed the shadow of his dozen wings, so small against a Cetus. "Yodwin! Yodwin!" She started to cry, then her head struck ground with a sickening jolt. The back of her skull went numb. All the sky was white stars for a moment. Her scalp felt wet and warm. Then suddenly the brightness dimmed. "Yodwin!" She heard herself breathe barely once, just before all the light in the world went out. Ariel licked her lips and burned her tongue on the sweetness of horn liquor. She was lying on hard, sloping ground, jagged pebbles pressed into her back like great pus-pocks, hurting her. She could feel the goatskin bottle on her chest and the warmth on her cheek and throat where it had splashed out, spilling. She was lying on the slope, her head lowest, her feet uphill from her. Her toes were numb. All this she knew without opening her eyes. She opened them slowly, saw the star-littered sky above through the slight glare of sun in her eyes. She tried to move and found it hard. Very hard. Her head came away, sticky from the ground, with a soreness that made her feel sick and stupid. She got one elbow under her and propped herself up, gazed straight at Osinus, a huge and constant blue with no shadow of wings across it now. She said, "Iodwin," and wept, but she was too weak to weep much. Her hand was cold. All her body was warm in the sun, but her left hand was cold. She looked at it presently and saw that the shadow of a boulder down the slope had crept across it. That frightened her. She snatched it from the shadow and sat up, twisted round, too quickly. Her temples pounded. She felt the blood running out of her head, and blotches of darkness wandered across the stars. Solstar was setting. She could see it as her vision cleared. It was barely 3 degrees above the horizon, and that would diminish as she descended the mountainside. She twisted her head around the other way. The pain increased sharply at the sudden move. She could already see the shade of night across the desert to the west. She had 2 hours, maybe less, to get back to the village by nightfall. With the wedding procession about to begin, who would miss one little slave? She chafed the leaden, cold-bitten hand in her lap. Felt nothing. It was numb. She groped for the flask at her neck. Yes! There was still a little of the horn liquor left. She poured the bright liquid out onto her limp, waxy hand, then grimaced, rocked in pain as the heat soaked through the frostbite, burned to the bone and then to the marrow. As the heat diminished and was gone, color returned to her hand. She could move it. She got to her knees and then to her feet, took a step, stumbled, and fell. She got up again and started down the slope. The soreness in her head was mostly dull, but when she missed her footing and staggered, the pain stabbed. She clung to the rocks of the mountainside, to the scrub weed, to the crannies. She raked her arm on bellthorn and scraped her knuckles raw. When she slipped twice, the winding trail crumbled beneath her feet and fell away down the mountainside like a tiny meteor shower, and always the sun sank lower as she descended the steeps, and the shadows lengthened, and the air grew warmer and thicker. Her breathing eased. Solstar had halfway sunk into the sea of dust by the time she heard the marriage hymns drifting up into the foothills on the soft plains wind. Strange. It seemed strange after the airless, muted steeps that here below, a 1/4 mile from the village, she could hear the singing so distinctly, so far away. She listened to the words floating in the long, harsh twilight. Far away, naret medium niardwe. Here in the foothills, just coming into the village, the path was much broader, smoother, less steep. She had come this way 12 times, up to the springs to catch minnows, up to play in the caves and gather mushrooms, and just 6 hours passed up into the mountains with Iodwin. Ariel grimaced with the pain of remembering. Iodwin had once pulled her out of one of those dark pools when she had slipped, pulled her out by the hair, and pounded her on the back as they knelt, wet and shuddering, on the slick, steep bank until Ariel had coughed up half a measure of bitter water, and no more would come. That had been 2 years ago. Ariel's head hurt now as she fled down the broad, smooth path by the caves towards the village. She did not want to think of Iodwin. She thought of the music instead. Kirhus idl temp kinteril maamam vitembrel feril. The words were closer now, a little louder. She realized that she was in the village. The smooth, square, whitewashed adobe houses gleamed in the dying light of Solstar. Gathered gauze draped softly from their dark windows. The great street that ran east-west was a long corridor of light. The little north-south side streets were dark as death. Anchuan, Anchuan, da venchelem, latzakel, marmakel, gamurganren. She was passing the houses more quickly now. She could see the village square ahead, filled with people. Then suddenly she was among the people, who did not seem to notice her, but went on with the singing, their eyes turned toward the half-gone sun. Pushing past them, she gave a cry to make them stop. The hymn broke off raggedly in mid-verse. The syndic frowned from his place before the bride and groom. The bride, in her new woven sari, glanced round. Behind her and the syndic, Ariel saw Yodwin's mother, a thin-faced aristocrat with hair like night. Old Bumba swayed beside her, nodding off into sleep even as she stood. Ariel stared at Bumba and the mother. "Yodwin!" she gasped breathlessly. The syndic, Yodwin's father, had been standing in shadow, came forward now into the glare. "Yes," he said. "Where is she?" "The ceremony cannot be completed without the bridal cup." He eyed the flask still hanging from Ariel's neck. "Has she sent you ahead with it?" She could not regain her breath. "No, she..." "Well, where is she?" demanded the syndic, pursing his fine lips. He gave an exasperated sigh. "How that girl can dawdle!" Turning to Ariel then, his patience thinned. "Well, out with it, drudge, or I'll have you beaten." "Gone!" cried Ariel, marveling that yet he did not understand. "The Icarus!" she faltered. The one with the wings." The syndic shook his head impatiently. "Are you gaming with me, drudge? Now where's my daughter, your mistress? Where's Yodwin?" Ariel gazed at him and longed to faint. The syndic glared at her and would not listen. The townspeople all stood, hushed now, staring. Her head felt light, ached. She felt her balance tip. She swayed and staggered. The syndic eyed her with sudden suspicion. "Have you been tasting of those hornflowers, girl?" Ariel looked back at him with dull surprise. I hit my head," she muttered, putting her hand to the sticky place behind and above her ear. She felt something at once soft and stiff amid her tangled hair. She pulled it free from the mat of blood. It was a feather. Black and a cubit long, it had been in her hair the whole time she had been coming down the mountain, and she had not known. Realization struck her with the coldness of shadow across strong light. She shuddered once, stared at the thing. Her hand snapped open, but the feather did not fall, stuck to the half-dried ooze on her palm. She shook her hand, and still it clung, black and blood-damp. She could not bear to touch it, nor pull it free with her other hand. The last ray of Solstar winked out like a candle snuffed. The square was smothered in shadow. All was night. Ariel could still see the vampire's feather dimly, a black streak in the dark against the paleness of her flesh. No one moved toward her. No one stirred to help her. She gave a long, low cry of revulsion and despair, and swooned. Hello everybody, this is Richie Valentine. I would like to thank each and every one of you for looking at this video, and I would encourage each and every one of you too, if you enjoyed it, like, comment, share, and subscribe, as that not only boosts me up the ladder as far as viewership is concerned, but it also makes this content more widely available to people who might not have known about it before. Thank you all for your support, as without any of you, I'm just a kid in his closet talking to his clothes, which I would probably do anyway, quite frankly, but your support means much, much more than any of you could possibly know.